Hello, in this video, I'm going to address the question of which is better, Oxford or St. Andrews. And I'm going to address that topic from someone who has attained master's degrees from both universities. So in the academic year 2023 and 2024, I attained a Master of Letters degree at St. Andrews. And in 2024 2025, I earned a Master of Science degree at the University of Oxford. I am from the United States, and so I turned down Oxford the first time I was accepted into the program. I actually went to St. Andrews instead of Oxford, and I was able to then attain that degree from St. Andrews and then go to Oxford the next year. The reason why I turned down Oxford the first time is because I had full funding at the University of St. Andrews through two scholarships, through the RNA Ransom Scholarship and also the St. Leonard's Global Leadership Scholarship. I was very fortunate to have a full funding package, which allowed me to go to St. Andrews. And I'm very grateful for that opportunity. And then I was fortunate enough to be reaccepted to Oxford. And so then I went on and attained a Master of Science degree from Oxford. So I'm kind of lucky as an American to have studied at both universities. And there are many people who may be interested or may be in the similar situation where they may be accepted to both universities and they may be dealing with the dilemma of which way should they go, professionally, personally, quality of life, and all these other factors. And so in this video, I want to break it down into four areas. There are many areas to look at, to consider when deciding University of St. Andrews or Oxford. However, I will address four in this video, which are going to be: one, academics; two, prestige; three, quality of life; and four, student life. And this is, again, as a postgraduate student, which is vastly different from undergraduate, but I will speak to my experience as a postgraduate. So on the first one, the academics, I'm going to give St. Andrews an 8 out of 10, and I'm going to give Oxford a 9 out of 10. And the reason for that is that Oxford has a much more rigorous grading process than St. Andrews. St. Andrews, when you submit an assignment or an essay, an assessment or a paper, it typically only gets graded by one professor who will then go and grade your paper, usually within 1 to 2 weeks, and you'll have a relatively quick turnaround. And it's only your dissertation at St. Andrews that is graded by two professors, in keeping with the standard protocol of double-blind grading on a dissertation, and that's pretty much standard in the UK. However, the Russell Group, particularly Oxford, is a lot more rigorous in its grading, so every assessment is actually graded over typically a 6 to 8 week period. Now, the reason why I'm not giving Oxford a 10 out of 10 on grading is because, at least in my department, in my field, in applied linguistics at Oxford, they have recently started to, you could say, lower the standard, where they're only having assessments graded by one professor, but then they're doing quality checks where they're selectively grading samples. And so they will sometimes have a second grader review the assignment, and they're saying that this is the same standard as it's always been. However, some would argue that that might be a lowering of the standard compared to what it was historically, when every single assessment was graded by two professors independently. However, they are taking a considerable amount of time to grade each assessment, and there's ostensibly a very rigorous quality review process during that 6 to 8 week period. However, the downside would be, you could say, if it's taking that long, 6 to 8 weeks, there could be situations where there could be grade control. And so at Oxford, you'll see where your grades are typically tethered to your previous grades. So you'll notice a spread which is very tight. So the good news is if you start out in your first term at Oxford scoring very, very well, they're probably going to tether your later terms to your first term. However, if you don't do as well in your first term, the reverse is true, where they're going to tether your later grades to your first term's outcome, and they will keep and you'll notice that all of your grades will be in a very, very tight range. So they don't like to see, you won't see typically wild deviation. So there could be an argument made for grade control at Oxford and sort of a very, very strict control process where each assignment is not fully independent and judged on its own merits, but actually everything seems to be tethered to other grades in a very tight, sort of controlled way. Whereas at St. Andrews, I noticed a more widespread of grades that could go particularly very high or still very passable, but maybe not quite as high. And so you'll see more latitude at St. Andrews on grading for individual assignments. Both are very rigorous, but I would say Oxford tends to be more rigorous and tends to have more grade suppression or grade deflation, particularly post-pandemic, where there was a period during the pandemic ostensibly where Oxford was inflating grades, and now they've gone back to a very, 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 very strict deflation of grades. So your chances of getting a distinction are very low. Probably 10% of a class might get a distinction. So in order to get a distinction on a dissertation or a paper, you would need something that's like, like Nobel Prize quality or something. You would need something really earth-shattering and something that's definitely an unambiguous contribution to the field. However, the reason why I don't give either Oxford or St. Andrews a 10 out of 10 is because I think they still have a ways to go, particularly with with AI coming out. And while both institutions have AI checks, I think both of them arguably could do a better job of policing students to ensure integrity in the process. What I recommend is at the master's level, they introduce the oral defense, which even in the United States, at previous institutions I had attended, at the master's level, you would have an oral defense of your final dissertation, which was graded. So, for example, like 10%. Why is an oral defense important, particularly now with AI and in the era of AI and questionable academic integrity? You really know who did the work when you have a closed note oral presentation and oral defense. So some of the AI prodigies that are scoring well just by submitting a piece of work may not do as well if they actually had to verbally defend their work in front of a panel closed note. And so one of the criticisms of students nowadays is that, they don't even remember their work if they're relying on AI. And that doesn't happen in an oral defense because it really proves that they did the work. Now, Oxford and the Russell Group universities have maintained a very high standard for AI and not allowing AI in assessments. And if a student does use AI, they have to attribute their AI, they have to attribute and give credit to AI. But typically, there's no allowing for AI in assessments at Oxford and the Russell Group universities, which I think is very good. However, I would argue they have a further way to go, and that oral defenses at the master's level should absolutely be mandatory. And what that would do is that would ensure that the person presenting that dissertation has actually done the work and can intellectually defend that work in an oral presentation without notes, or even with some notes, but definitely to present their work verbally would eliminate any doubts as to who actually did that assessment. And so I think that that's why I wouldn't even give Oxford a 10 out of 10. And I would give St. Andrews an 8 out of 10 because I think they even have further to go to ensure integrity in their work. Now, both St. Andrews and Oxford unquestionably are far beyond like normal universities in terms of academic integrity and quality control standards. But I would argue that in the era of AI, both universities have further to go. Okay, moving on to number 2, and that's prestige. Both universities are quite prestigious. St. Andrews is the third oldest university in the English-speaking world. It was founded in 1411 by a papal bull. Prince William and Kate Middleton attended St. Andrews, and it has a very long and prestigious legacy and very, very high quality. Statistically, it's actually harder in many cases to get into St. Andrews than it is to get into Oxford because St. Andrews is smaller and has fewer spaces for applicants, and it's very elite. And so Oxford, founded in 1096, some argue that the date was more like 1167 when it became more institutionalized. But either way, Oxford is the oldest university in the English-speaking world, and it is routinely ranked number 1 in the world. And when you get into the area of prestige, I'm just going to give you some of the rankings. For example, The Guardian, as of 2026, ranks St. Andrews at number 2 and Oxford at number 1. And that is the same as the previous year, in 2025, those rankings were the same. Now, in 2024, The Guardian actually ranked St. Andrews as number 1. So St. Andrews actually did take the place of number 1 in 2024, beating Oxford and Cambridge. As of 2026, according to the Times Higher Education, St. Andrews is ranked number 162 and Oxford is number 1. And then 2026 QS World Ranking, St. Andrews is 113 and Oxford is number 4. So, in terms of Times Higher Education and QS World Rankings, when you rank the universities on a global scale, Oxford does quite a bit better in the global rankings, and those Times Higher Education and also QS World Rankings, those are looking at larger universities, and larger universities are going to unquestionably benefit from the global rankings. And so St. Andrews, being a smaller school, is not going to hold its weight as well as Oxford, obviously, because St. Andrews is smaller and doesn't produce as much research. However, you could argue that St. Andrews packs a powerful punch given its small size, that its weight and its influence exceeds its small size by far. So when you put a small university like St. Andrews into the category of the larger Russell Group universities in the UK, the 24 Russell Group, St. Andrews does exceptionally well considering it's not large enough and it's not a massive, large research institution like the Russell Group universities. However, given its small size, you could argue that it's actually superior to the Russell Group universities when you actually weight size for size. So when you look at the small number of scholars at St. Andrews and students, that they actually outperform the Russell Group when you look at pound per pound comparison. But in terms of just sheer volume, St. Andrews doesn't produce the sheer volume that the bigger universities produces, but it's small and elite. So prestige, it's definitely, if you're going around the world as a global academic, Oxford is going to be more readily recognized, and it's going to just slip off the tongue. Everyone's going to recognize Oxford instantly. St. Andrews might require a little bit further explanation, but once people fully understand it, they're definitely going to recognize the value and the prestige of St. Andrews. And in certain circles in the UK and in Europe, St. Andrews would surpass surpass Oxford in certain areas. So in terms of elitism, there are contexts where St. Andrews would actually be seen as more prestigious than Oxford. Again, it would depend on what you studied and sort of the other nuances, but in certain circles, St. Andrews actually carries more weight than Oxford does. However, Oxford is always going to be Oxford. I mean, it's always going to be at the very top, if not the number one. And that just goes to um, the 1,000-year legacy of the institution. And it's virtually, in some ways, it's virtually impossible for any university to really compete with Oxford in just in terms of the history, the institution, and it's something that all the great institutions of the world have tried to replicate, like Cambridge tried to replicate it, and then many of the elite US institutions like Harvard and Yale essentially modeled themselves off of the Oxford model, which continues to be the gold standard for the world. Next, in terms of quality of life, I'm going to give St. Andrews a 10 out of 10, and I'm going to give Oxford a 6.5. Now, that may sound quite brutal, but I would say in terms of quality of life, St. Andrews, as a postgraduate who isn't necessarily out partying and clubbing, St. Andrews, I would say, far surpasses Oxford in terms of quality of life, being that you can quite comfortably walk from one side of St. Andrews to the other in 20 minutes. You don't need a bicycle. And once you take the bus to the station at St. Andrews, from the bus station, you're within 20 minutes of anything in St. Andrews. And the quality of life and the peace and the tranquility of St. Andrews is unsurpassed. It's right up against the ocean and beautiful coastline. East Sands and West Sands Beach are there, and it's right next to the St. Andrews ancient golf course, the birthplace of golf. And so it's, if you like to golf, or even if you like to go to the driving range at St. Andrews and de-stress and be right on the ocean and just have this amazing, majestic, peaceful place to live where you can think your best thoughts academically, I would say St. Andrews, without a doubt, is unsurpassed. And in fact, the weather is comfortably good. Many people think Scotland is just always gloomy and cloudy, but there's something about the ocean and the particular climate right there with St. Andrews that's very unique. And there's a lot more sun than many people would expect. And it's just got a very nice, peaceful, wholesome atmosphere. It does have deeply religious roots. Even Oxford has deeply religious roots. Many saints were educated at Oxford. But St. Andrews has a very spiritually pure, tranquil atmosphere. And I've never been anywhere in the world as peaceful as St. Andrews. And so in terms of quality of life, I would rank it 10 out of 10. And it's, even though it's kind of in some ways remote, it's very well connected. There is an airport in Dundee just up the road, and where you can connect it to any other major airport. And Edinburgh is only about an hour and an hour and a half away maximum by train. And it's a very comfortable train ride to Edinburgh from St. Andrews. And so from Edinburgh, you can get very easily anywhere in the world. So you basically have all the access of Edinburgh without having to live in Edinburgh. So you can go enjoy Edinburgh on the weekend and enjoy all the things in Edinburgh and still live in the tranquility of St. Andrews. So in terms of quality of life, definitely 10 out of 10. The Scottish beef, the very high quality of the water. It's very, very pure water in that area, and cows and sheep grazing in the field around it, and it's just quite majestic. And I would say, as an academic who really wants to focus on your academics, definitely St. Andrews. Now, Oxford, why do I give Oxford a 6.5? Well, there's many challenges with Oxford. While there are many, many advantages of Oxford in terms of the town, there's many challenges. Construction around the station has been going on for years, and it blocks access through the town, making it difficult to drive from one part of town to another. You have to kind of circumnavigate the town to get where you want to by car. Driving transportation by car can be very precarious. In Oxford, it's very, very, very dense with a very high amount of traffic and bicyclists. And so if you're studying there, you're going to be on bicycle or walking, as your probably bicycle is your primary means of transportation. So in many ways, that's a positive, and I enjoyed riding my bicycle for the year and getting into shape. At the same time, you have to be careful because you're on bicycle and it's very busy. So you need to make sure you have your bicycle having all the lights when you're out at nighttime and have all the safety gear. And you really have to watch out because things get crowded and accidents happen. So safety first. And it's particularly challenging with people with children because in many cases they're putting the children on like a attachable trailer on the back of their bicycle and taking children around the town by bicycle. And so families that are going to Oxford with children may have a challenging time. Many do it, and many of them have attachments to their bicycles and they're towing their kids along. Some children are even out there on their bicycles at young ages, just going all over with their bicycles. But again, as a parent, you may be a little concerned about that. So that's one challenge. It's one benefit of Oxford, but it's also one challenge is the bicycles. It's a double-edged sword. In some ways, it's positive and it's good for your fitness. In some ways, it can be a little tiresome at times, and challenging. There's also a lot of tourism in Oxford. So if you're going to the Bodleian libraries, the Divinity Library in the Quad there, or the Radcliffe Camera Library, which is the iconic Radcliffe Camera, you're going to have to go through a lot of tourists, particularly in the summer. So when you're writing your dissertation in the summertime and you want to go to the Bodleian Library, the main libraries, you're going to have some substantial issues. And there are signs in front of the Bodleian Library saying this is a working library and be quiet. But the tourists seemed like they just completely ignore those signs. And so there were times I was in the Bodleian Library writing my dissertation, and there would be an insane amount of tourists in the Quad being very, very loud and very disruptive. And so it's good for the economy of Oxford to always have a lot of tourists, but as a student who's trying to produce your best academic work, it could be very challenging. Now, the mitigation of that is depending on what college you're in. Your college may have very nice libraries you can go to. I was in Kellogg College, and so the library was not so good, to be frank. But, if you're in St. John's College or Jesus College or one of the other colleges that are older, Christchurch, you probably have much better libraries. So it depends on what college you're assigned to. So while everyone's under the University of Oxford and they get their degree from the University of Oxford, everyone is also part of a college. So depending on what college you're in could dramatically change the type of student life and experience you have. And not all students can use all college libraries. You're allowed to use the main libraries, and then you're allowed to use your college library. So if you're relying on the main university libraries like I was, and you're just constantly going through an insane amount of tourists who are very loud and very disruptive, then it really does impact your quality of education. So it depends. Now, my department library was pretty good, and I would go there sometimes. But logistically, travel, use of college libraries or main library can be very challenging in Oxford, and especially too that many of the libraries close early. which really surprised me. Like the Bodleian Library and the Radcliffe Camera sometimes closed really early, like at 6 p.m. And they were closed on holidays, and so it was shocking that during very crucial times of your research, you're basically without a library. So you'd have to either just do all the work in your home, or find some place to go write your assessments or your dissertation without always having a library. So the libraries aren't 24/7, and so there can be challenges, especially with the tourists. So I would say that definitely impacts quality of life and studying. And then the final one I'll get to is student life, number 4. I would give St. Andrews a 9 out of 10 for student life, just because you feel very connected to the university, and there are many events going on, and to your department and your college at St. Andrews, and just overall the things you can do, whether it's ocean water sports or whether it's the gym. Actually, the gym at St. Andrews is far superior to the gym at Oxford. So Oxford, for instance, has very limited resources at their gym, and so you have to make an appointment online, and the Oxford gym is not very good. St. Andrews has a far, far, far better gym. Now, the St. Andrews gym, the My St. gym, does get booked to capacity, so there are peak hours. So you have to kind of monitor that online before you go to the gym. But the gym itself is far better and more accessible than the gym at Oxford, where you have to basically go through town and go through all the madness of town to get to the gym. And then the gym itself is very limited in terms of resources and what's available. And it's quite surprising that Oxford would have such a limited gym for students. So I would definitely say the quality of life, but the quality of life at Oxford, in some ways, the student life, you could say, is as good or better. There's always going to be black tie events, balls, things that you can do through your college. I didn't take advantage of that as much as I should have, but you can schedule any number. If you want to just be James Bond and just constantly go to balls and formal events, black tie events at Oxford, there's pretty much always something going on, and you can book one of those events. During my time at Oxford, I was a member of the Oxford Union Society and would go to the debates. Typically, I'd show up in a tuxedo, in a black tie tuxedo, and I would go to the Thursday night debates at the Oxford Union. And I did, as a member of the union, did participate in some of those debates as well. During the intermission, when they opened up to the floor, any member of the Oxford Union can raise your card and actually participate in the debate. Then the after hours debate as well. So that was very rewarding. So I'm going to give Oxford and St. Andrews a tie when it comes to quality of life, because the things that Oxford doesn't have that St. Andrews has, Oxford definitely makes up for it in other areas, and I would say vice versa. So they're very different, but I would say the opportunity, they both have tremendous opportunities, and so it's really just being aware of what's going on. But I would say the quality of life overall, I would say, is comparable. And then it also depends on the values. So, for example, if you like being close to London, but you don't like living in London, Oxford is very close, very easy to get to London from Oxford. So if you're not quite a rural type of person, Oxford may appeal. If you're more like London-centered type of person and you like to go to a lot of the black tie events and balls and formal events with the colleges, and particularly, being a member of one of the colleges and being plugged into those social events. And then Oxford also attracts a lot of like globally powerful international people, prime ministers, celebrities, academics. are going to be there quite often, giving talks and presentations, or at the Oxford Union debating. And so the opportunities at Oxford, just being in the town itself, are quite substantial. So the things that Oxford suffers from in terms of logistical pain with the bicycles and everything, I think it more than compensates in terms of opportunities. With everything going on at Oxford, on any day of the calendar year, there's going to be something going on in Oxford all the time. Oxford also does have several very large parks. So if you want to get away from the madness of the tourists downtown, there are many parks that you can go to, and there's a lot of nature. There's like Port Meadow, which is like a massive pasture where you could still see cows grazing in the field and horses and things like that. And it's right on the Thames, I guess they call it Thames, since Thames River. And you can go on the river walk, which is really nice. I lived right next to the Thames River, and so we go out there and walk quite often. And yeah, it's hard to exactly compare the two universities and say which one is better. I mean, you can't just decisively say it. I mean, most people would probably default to saying Oxford is better just because it's Oxford. However, I would say that I'm very grateful for both St. Andrews and Oxford, and I think they both have a lot to offer the world. And for anything that was negative or inconvenient, I would say it more than compensated in terms of just like the tremendous benefits and exposure and life-altering dynamics of both schools. So I would say if you could attend both, I would attend both. And I'm exceptionally grateful that I had the opportunity to study both at St. Andrews and Oxford. And really, I mean, the things that separate the two in many cases are like splitting hairs, and really gets down to individual preference and also what you're studying, and subjective factors that are not necessarily anything about the university, but it's about personal preferences. Also, too, there's the Scotland versus England dynamic. So obviously, St. Andrews is in Scotland. It's a Scottish university. Oxford is in England. It's an English university. So there's also some national pride and national identities that go into both institutions being actually in different countries within the United Kingdom. And that's quite interesting when you talk about the political landscape of the United Kingdom and the pride that the Scottish feel in their institutions and the pride that the English feel in their institutions. And it's, as an American, to learn about the dynamics, the social and political dynamics of both institutions was quite interesting to see all of that play out in the dynamics between the two. And Scotland has great institutions like the University of Edinburgh, the University of Glasgow, and St. Andrews. And Oxford obviously has Oxford and Cambridge and many other great universities and institutions. And so there's some political dynamics involved as well. And that's pretty much my experience with both universities. And I'm very grateful. And I am happy to make any follow-up videos or answer any more specific questions anyone may have. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video, and I look forward to your comments. And if you've also had experiences with St. Andrews and Oxford both, and you can comment on the comparing and contrasting both institutions, I welcome those comments below. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.